The Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom. The game I waited for, sometimes rather impatiently, for 6 years. Breath of the Wild changed the Zelda series upon its release, for better or for worse, and this game would be a direct sequel. Though most were excited, some Zelda fans worried for the newest entry to the series. They didn't like the direction Breath of the Wild took, so they didn't want another game like it. They thought that reusing the map would make the game too similar to the game they'd already put hundreds of hours in. They were concerned at how long the game was taking to make, especially considering the reused assets and map. I've put around 15 to 20 hours into Tears of the Kingdom so far. I've found a stable, a fairy fountain, various shrines, 3 towns, Zora's Domain, Hateno Village, and Kakariko Village, a large underworld area, and I've completed 1 temple as part of the main storyline, the Water Temple. If you haven't completed any of these areas yet, you might want to click off this video to avoid spoilers. This is my early game review with both pros and cons of The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Pros: the art style and the world. Let's start with the pros. This game is beautiful. It has the same art style as Breath of the Wild, and it's simply breathtaking, especially in certain lighting. Recently during my playthrough, I was on Wellspring Island, high above Zora's Domain, and I had to stop and watch as the sun set in Hyrule. The colors danced along the horizon, and it made me feel at peace. The world building here is also phenomenal. When you're on the Sky Islands, you can look out and see various landmarks on the surface and on other Sky Islands. You can go from the highest Sky Islands to the surface, to underground caves, and even to the depths without hitting a loading screen. Speaking of, I've barely even had a chance to explore the depths yet, and I cannot believe an area as large as this one was completely kept a secret during the marketing of this game. I seriously had no idea it existed until I stumbled upon it in Kakariko Village. Abilities. The abilities in this game completely differ from its predecessor. Early on, you're given Fuse, Ascend, Ultra Hand, and Recall. Here's a quick summary. Fuse allows you to fuse things together, believe it or not, mainly used to create better weapons or shields. Ascend lets you travel upwards through rock, mostly helpful to quickly leave a cave or well, but is also used in combat and puzzles. Ultra Hand lets you glue things together essentially, which is used to build various contraptions for combat, travel, and puzzle use. And Recall rewinds time on an object. This can also be used for puzzles, combat, and traversal, but is very useful to quickly get to Sky Islands. Rocks often fall from the sky, and Recall allows the player to reverse the rock once it hits the surface to send it back into the sky, catching a ride in the process. Weapons. Now, let's talk weapons. Many people disliked the weapon durability in Breath of the Wild and were eager to see if Tears of the Kingdom would fix what they considered to be a broken system. I think that Tears of the Kingdom did a good job with this. You can fuse sticks, swords, or other weapons with monster horns, bombs, rocks, etc. to increase their power and durability. If you're not interested in getting familiar with the fusing system, no worries. You don't have to. Just use the weapons you find around the world. But if you want to make your weapons less fragile, then get to fusing. I'm a huge fan of this system, and I'm still mind-blown by how many things you can do with it. It helped solve what many consider to be a weapon durability problem in the previous game, while not forcing it upon players who don't want to learn it or breaking the system entirely. Combat. Combat in Tears of the Kingdom so far seems more difficult than Breath of the Wild, but not by much. Early game, you're pretty easy to kill, similar to Breath of the Wild, with your low hearts and low-level armor. You also likely don't have great weapons, all of which can make fighting enemies likely more difficult than it will be later in the game. The system is generally the same as Breath of the Wild, but there are various new enemies like the Battle Talus and boss bokoblins that make fighting more interesting. Building. Man, you can build a lot in this game. As mentioned before, the Ultra Hand ability allows you to glue items together to your heart's content. People have been building all sorts of vehicles in particular, which I have yet to explore much in my playthrough, but seems to be endless in what you can create. This is one of those aspects that if you want to have a more simple playing experience and you're not interested in building things, you don't really have to. You might be guided to build in certain shrines or other puzzles, but for the most part, it's optional. And I love this optionality. In a game that prides itself with allowing the player to do what they want, how they want to, I think this system is perfect. You can create a plane to fly around Hyrule, or you can ignore that completely and just walk around or ride your horse. It allows for all different types of players to enjoy the same game. Dungeons/temples and bosses. In my opinion, dungeons or temples are much better in Tears of the Kingdom than they were in Breath of the Wild. That game had 4 divine beasts that were nearly identical in atmosphere with very similar bosses. They were not considered very difficult or long by many gamers, especially not when compared to Zelda dungeons in every other 3D title before Breath of the Wild. I've only completed the Water Temple so far in Tears of the Kingdom, but I already like it much better than the Divine Beasts. It's accurately themed as a water temple, which gives it a unique and distinct identity. And the boss. I loved that boss. It was so unique and cool, and I adored the fact that there was a puzzle element like older Zelda games. Instead of the fight being a simple combat challenge, it factored in a sort of puzzle where you had to find the monster's weak spot and exploit it. As someone who isn't the best at combat, which you know if you've watched any of my playthrough, I thought this was great. Story. My favorite aspect so far has been the storyline in Tears of the Kingdom. As I mentioned, I've only completed the first temple, so I haven't progressed very far in the story yet. But it appears as though when Ganondorf was revived, Zelda was sent back to an ancient past with the Zonai. I'm not sure what will come of this yet, but I am a sucker for time travel in video games. I think it's such a cool mechanic, and whether Link will be able to time travel or not, please don't tell me, I don't want to be spoiled. I think the direction the story went in this game is awesome. Zelda appears to be the Sage of Time, with other sages from the various races popping up as well. Ganondorf in this game, damn, look at him. He looks so cool, it's insane. I'm not on his side or anything, but he looks awesome, and I hope we have a legendary sword duel at the end of this game. The world definitely feels different. The last pro I'm going to discuss today is how the map truly does feel different. I have to admit that I was one of those who were worried before Tears of the Kingdom released that the reused map would basically just feel like Breath of the Wild with some new abilities and Sky Islands. I can confidently say now that I rarely feel like I'm actually playing Breath of the Wild while exploring this world. The world is so incredibly different that I often don't know where I am or where to go, despite putting a lot of hours into Breath of the Wild over the past several years just exploring the map. This point leads us into the cons though, because unfortunately, there are some for me. Cons. Although different, similarities to its predecessor are felt. Going off of my last pro, although the map as a whole does feel different, there are various elements that feel a little too similar to Breath of the Wild in my opinion. One is the shrines. I don't know what I expected, but the fact that the shrines in this game are nearly identical to its predecessor with different theming and puzzles was a little disappointing. The process of being plopped into a shrine, doing puzzles, and then getting into the final area where you speak to a monk or statue who gives you a spirit orb complete with the same sound effects is starting to get a little stale for me. This pattern emerged with other things in Tears of the Kingdom as well, like the Water Temple for instance. It feels like they took the Divine Beasts, replaced the puzzles, and added a new theme on top, and then called it a new temple. The temple followed the same process as Divine Beasts. You get a map that shows you exactly where the terminals or things you need to activate are, and then you go around finding them in any order. When you're done, you return to the main area and fight the boss. I totally understand that I am oversimplifying it to a degree, and what I'm classifying as cons aren't inherently bad. They still feel mostly different as a whole, and I think that the shrines and temples in this game are so far much better than Breath of the Wild. I can completely see the argument of if it's not broken, don't fix it, which would explain why they use the bases from Breath of the Wild to create these elements in Tears of the Kingdom. But I do personally wish that they started 100% from scratch when creating these, rather than starting with the base from Breath of the Wild and building off of it. Especially when it comes to shrines and dungeons, which didn't have to tie back to Breath of the Wild literally at all and could have been completely different. This is unlike other elements like the art style or the map that had to be mostly the same for the game to make sense. Too much to do? This next point might make no sense to a lot of people, but I am a little overwhelmed with everything you can do in Tears of the Kingdom. I think the Zelda series is in a weird place right now with its fans. There's a lot of people with completely opposite ideas of what they want Zelda games to be like. Mainly, in my opinion, this is due to the long-running series picking up a lot of new gamers with Breath of the Wild who enjoy more modern-type games, leaving Zelda veterans to feel like they've been left in the past. I have a video on my channel that I'll link in the description box if you're interested about how Breath of the Wild split the Zelda fanbase. I think Tears of the Kingdom might have furthered that divide. I used to think that Breath of the Wild was too complicated of a game to truly resonate with me, especially coming from the past 3D Zelda games that were a little more simplistic, not necessarily with the puzzles or combat, but with the controls. You'd get items spaced out so you had time to get acclimated with them. You'd have one sword and a couple shields you could use, and the combat system wasn't complicated to understand. Breath of the Wild seemed to be so complicated by comparison. I can't collect hearts from jars anymore, I have to collect food and then cook it myself. I can't find rupees by just cutting grass anymore, I have to actually find things and sell them for money. I don't have an unbreakable sword that I always have access to, but instead I have to pick up various items that break all the time. These reasons have contributed to why I didn't click with Breath of the Wild at first, and have only in more recent years started to appreciate what it did to the Zelda series and gaming in general. All of this is crazy to think about because compared to Tears of the Kingdom, Breath of the Wild is the most simple game ever. Sometimes when I'm trying to figure out what a certain Zonai piece does in Tears of the Kingdom, I think about how simple times were when I was just sprinting around the world in Breath of the Wild. This is completely dependent on every player and what they enjoy in video games. As such, I know many will not agree with me on this, which is totally fine, but I sometimes feel like this game took the base of Breath of the Wild and added so much to it that it almost gets to the point of feeling muddy. I almost wish that, similar to the shrines and temples discussion before, they had come up with a way to fundamentally change the base of the game. Before the game's release, I always thought that creating a sequel or prequel to Breath of the Wild that took place mostly or entirely in a different time, either past or future, would have been a great way to reuse the map without it feeling the same at all. This would have allowed the reuse of the map and general geographical locations, but with massive overhauls to its looks due to changes over time. Completely new villages and places to explore on the surface of Hyrule since so much time had passed. I think something like this would have changed the foundation fundamentally, so Tears of the Kingdom didn't feel like Breath of the Wild plus a lot of things sprinkled on top. This is a weird comparison, but I enjoy cooking, and one thing I love is pasta. Most people don't salt their pasta water enough, so the pasta is not flavorful by itself. When you add the sauce, it'll be okay, but it'll never be as good as it would have been if you had made sure the pasta itself was tasty before adding the stuff on top of it. In this analogy, the pasta is the base world, shrines, and temples of Tears of the Kingdom, and the sauce is the new stuff, the Sky Islands, the depths, the new themes in certain areas, etc. I wanted to note how different this approach was when compared to Majora's Mask, the direct sequel to Ocarina of Time and what many consider to be the best Zelda game or the best game of all time. Majora's Mask, although a direct sequel, was so different from Ocarina of Time that you could play it without playing the first and still have a complete gaming experience. It took place in an entirely different world than Ocarina of Time, with the only overlapping characters being Link and Epona. Tears of the Kingdom, conversely, feels very much so like a sequel. And is this bad, for a sequel to feel like a sequel? Of course not. But I personally was expecting a bit more fundamental changes, rather than a lot of same foundation, different dressing like we got in Tears of the Kingdom. Final thoughts. Since I haven't played the majority of Tears of the Kingdom yet, I anticipate making a part 2 to this video in the future once I've finished the game to see if any of my stances evolved or changed. Again, this is just an early game review, but in my opinion, the pros outweigh the cons with this game so far. I think it's stronger in many ways than Breath of the Wild, and I can't wait to play the rest of it. I'd love to hear your thoughts below. I know I'll likely have a lot of you disagreeing with me, which is good. People are allowed to have their own opinions based on what they like about video games, and I hope we can discuss in the comments. Please subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and check out my Tears of the Kingdom playthrough if you're interested. Until next time, have a good one.